Hello, my name is Sebastian De Leon, and I will be going over a literature review for the following article. Biomechanical stability analysis of a standalone cage, static and rotational dynamic plate on a two-level vertical fusion construct. I will be looking at this article and going over the experimental design, goals, and potential significance of the study, analyzing data, conclusions, and findings, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the reported findings, as well as alluding to cadaver ethics and comparing that to last week's findings on the matter. Going over some terms, anterior cervical discectomy and fusion will be abbreviated by ACDF. The two-level cervical fusion involves two or more dynamic segments of the spine. An intact spine is normal or unbroken. Interbody spacers or standalone cages are used interchangeably in the article, more or less meaning the same thing. They are insertions that are put where the disc once was to restore disc height between the vertebrae. There are three hypotheses that were tested in the paper. One of them was that ACDF using standalone interbody spacers will significantly reduce the range of motion from the intact spine, that the use of static rotational dynamic plates will significantly augment the stability of those standalone interbody spacers, and that a plating systems will have similar beneficial effects when compared to one another. So the potential significance of the study is that they can build upon the understanding of plate constructs and how they augment the stability of two-level ACDF cases. This is why cadaver studies are so important because they help us develop better treatments that give the patients better outcomes. This can also add credibility to the usage of mechanically different plate constructs. A competitive market is good for the advancement of medicine, I must say that. So cadaver usage. 11 cadavers segments of this from C3 to C7 were sourced from 48 and a half year olds approximately, five of which were male and six were female. Now, they were screened radiographically for conditions that could alter the biomechanics of their spinal segments, such as metastatic disease, fractures, or bone spurs. So, figure one, I took this from the article so I could better illustrate the mechanics at hand. The static locking plate, or SLP, is shown here. As you can see, there is a rigid relationship between the screw and the plate that helps reduce the mobility of those spinal segments. The Dupuy-Synthes vector variable angle plating system is our rotational dynamic treatment that allows motion through via a ball and socket relationship of screw and plate. Both of the fixations were unicortical, meaning that they went through one of the cortical layers of the vertebrae, not engaging the other. They were also self-drilling. As you can see here, the spacers shown with the pink arrows are in place in every single one of the spinal segments in this study. The range of motion was broken down into three parameters, being deflection and extension, lateral bending, and axial rotation. They were tested sequentially for the intact spines and the ACD with the SAC at the two spinal segments. They were tested, and these forces were applied using a mechanical apparatus. The plates and screws were then inserted, and the ROM parameters were tested once again. As you can see here, we have the intervertebral spacers and the two treatment groups that were randomly assigned to the spines. The data were analyzed using an ANOVA with Bonferroni correction for 5 comparisons, which are listed here. The results were abridged, at least for the purposes of this review. The SAC insertion drastically reduced the range of motion from intact spine at the two insertions, as evidenced by figures 4 and 5. Plating further decreased the range of motion from the standalone cage via figures 6, 7, and 8. And interestingly, there was no significant difference between the performance of SLP and of vector plates, which I found interesting because it happened non-intuitively. The the plates, the ball and socket plate, you would think would move more than the static plate, but the opposite was true. There was an insignificant difference, an insignificant increase in stability using the vector model. Going over the strengths and weaknesses of the article, cadaveric testing gives useful biomechanical data. Props to this article and ones like it. It is important to study these cadavers because we can then translate these experiments into clinical settings and give the patients better outcomes. The critiques are I found an inaccurate figure reference in the experimental protocol and a miscolored graph legend in figure 5. The weaknesses are as follows. Post-operative tissue changes were not accounted for. as is the nature with an ex vivo study. The tissue change it just doesn't happen because the model is dead. So this will require clinical testing to answer these questions which are in the air. You were unable to replicate physiological loads, or sorry, they were unable to replicate physiological loads using their mechanical apparatus. So they had acknowledged their limitations, and the normal loads were not simulated. The conclusions, were they supported by the methodology of the study and the data it produced? I would say yes. The hypotheses were reasonable statements, easily addressed by the results, and covered by the bandwidth of the study's assumptions. Discrepancies were accounted for in the discussion, something I always like to see in academic works. As for cadaver use, recalling what I learned about last week, it's ethically responsible and tactful to include where the cadavers are sourced from, as there is an increasing number of unethically sourced cadavers. Most institutes recommend cadavers be donated and acquired through donations, but the ethical transparency and integrity that comes with including this sentence, because that's what it is, a sentence in the article itself, would be very good for the pushing of ethics. Do I find the use of the cadaver's resources in the study ethical, moral, and wise? I would say no. I would have included that sentence. It wouldn't have cost much. Again, the AAA says that it requires institutions to document cadaver donations, but this doesn't have to translate into the articles themselves. So I would find it responsible and ethical to include a sentence or two on how these cadavers were sourced in an article. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Also, these are my citations.